So thanks for coming to this presentation. We're going to be talking about spectral imaging, a thing that DT has been involved in for just about 10 years. About 10 years ago, we made our first specialized system for multispectral imaging. The system you see here in the top right, which was the DT Duo Spectra developed for the National Archives and Record Administration. They had a collection of burnt military service records. Burned things are not very easy to read. The Duo Spectra allowed them to read those military records, facilitating veterans' care for those who were affected. We also sell various camera systems without IR filters, with specialty equipment like the bronze color UV attachment and various targets and accessories to facilitate multispectral capture. Today we'll be talking about the newest addition to our multispectral line, the rainbow. The rainbow, wait for it, ready? Next. Powerful spectral imaging made simple. Next. So we'll take a look at what that actually means like in reality in just a moment, but a refresh primer on what is color, what is the normal kind of camera. Most cameras are not spectral cameras, most cameras are color cameras. So what is color? Don't worry, this is very basic to you. This one lasts 2 minutes or less. Color is part of the visible spectrum, which is a narrow band of the electromagnetic spectrum that goes from gamma rays out to long radio waves. Next. A lot of that gets absorbed in the air, so evolutionarily not very useful, or goes through things like X-rays, not very useful for seeing. But the part that goes through the atmosphere, that lands on an object and makes it into your eye, can be part of the visible spectrum. That's the rainbow part there, stuck between UV and IR. Next. In your eye are these weird-looking things, rods and cones. There are 3 color-detecting sensors in your eye. They're named S, L, and M for short, medium, and long. And those help you to see, that is, be experiencing those 3 sections of that narrow band of that electromagnetic spectrum. The result of which is color. Color is a sensation, not a physical reality. Physical reality is the spectrum of radiation that enters your eye. The sensation is the color. Oh, that's red. That's cool. A good analogy of this is what is different in your sensing. When you think about the human ear, we hear chords as well as individual notes. So if I were to go da, 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 and then have them all happen at the same time, you would hear a harmonious, pleasant chord. But you can still hear, detect, and isolate the 3 individual notes that go into that holistic sensation. That is not the case with light. Your eyes react to the underlying spectrum that is the physical reality, but that is not what you see. What you see is just the sensation they create, that holistic color. In most cases, a camera that sees color is all you need, because what you're trying to do is see color, see like the human eye sees. But there are use cases where it's more helpful to go beyond that holistic and see the components, to see the spectrum, a la spectral imaging. The rainbow system in front of you does 11 visible bands, 11 slices of the visible spectrum, and 4 bands, 2 in the UV and 2 in the IR, that fall outside of the visible spectrum. There is an alternative set of lights that's going to be delivered as that does a UV, a visible, and an IR. But today we'll be focused on the solution that we think is most profound, which is the 15-band solution, which allows us to do a whole lot of powerful things. Let's take a look at this live. So we're going to do a demo of infrared, a demo of UV fluorescence, and then a demo that I call kit and caboodle, which is all 15 bands plus some bonus bands. So the first thing we're going to do is drop some nice subject matter in front of the camera. This is a letter which has some printed ink. And we'll be able to compose inside of LiveView. A lot of special images actually don't use any sort of modern technology, so they don't have niceties that we've all come to expect like LiveView. This one does. We position it in the camera, we push the magic button. At this point, there is no danger to your eyes. We're only talking about visible and infrared light, which are not problematic for your vision. I will let you know when we get to the UV. So it's going to capture an image there smack dab in the middle of the visible band, and a second image that's happening right now. And you're like, where's the light? Exactly. This is the infrared radiation, which is not visible, and therefore you're not seeing it. The camera, however, is going to see it. And after those 2 images are captured, processed through, which is finishing in 3 seconds, we're going to be able to see the visible and the infrared images of this object. So Ben's going to bring that up. Most recent one. And here is the visible. This looks like your eye sees it. You know, dark things are dark, light things are light. No big surprises. In the infrared capture, we'll see that the ink on the left piece of paper vanishes. Ink that is blue reflects a lot of blue light, right? Ink may or may not reflect the same amount of infrared or UV as you would intuit from its visible spectrum. So while the printed ink is dark and absorbs a lot of infrared, the handwritten ink is not. It is light in terms of, or transparent in terms of infrared light. So, sort of a vanishing act. Next, we'll be doing UV light. Before I start that, we're going to put in some different subject matter, and I'm going to advise you that UV light, UV radiation, just like it is deleterious to your skin, it's deleterious to your eyes. It will not blind you instantly, nor should you be chalant about the degradation that it can create. So, we have passed around goggles. You are not required to wear them. You could simply turn away for a little bit if you wanted. But if you want to watch the experience live, my suggestion is to pop those on. And even then, don't stare directly into the light. That said, this is not so pretty. We're also bringing down here a CH open source UV target. There's a different UV target we normally recommend. We're going to start the UV exposure now. This is your final warning. Go ahead. We recommend normally a different UV target that we don't have with us today called the UV Innovations target. And that is one of several targets we sell that are multispectral in nature. I can advise you the UV is now off. The next exposure will be lime. And those 2 images are now going to go get processed and put up on screen. Now, the thing about UV, I'm going to be using a UV flashlight, but I'm going to be cupping it in such a way that you're not going to see any direct UV light, so I don't consider there to be any meaningful danger here. This was painted with UV pigments. In visible light, they are basically non-existent, or not visible, just say they're not non-existent, but nicely painted on there. When we look at the visible image of this capture, all we see is a slight variation in tone on this one, which is sort of vertical strips. And you can see it does have a slight sheen, slight difference in darkness there, otherwise it's empty. But in the UV fluorescing capture, in which we hit it with UV light and then filter the sensor so it's only seeing visible light, we see this pattern emerge here of the object. Let's switch over to the previous capture. Cool. So that is the UV fluorescing capture. Let's go back to the presentation and talk about kit and caboodle. So we're going to get kit and caboodle set up. That is all of the bands. So far, you saw captures that only took a minute or two. In the case of the first one, like literally 30 seconds. In the case of the second one, like a minute and a half, 2 minutes, like that. Now we're going to drop in here some different blue and pigments. Now I'll tell you all about this target as the capture. Again, nice live view. Again, the beginning of this will be UV. I'll advise you both when they're starting and ending. Ready then?
All right.
So we're going to start the UV exposures now. Go ahead. Now this is going to be a significantly longer series of captures. The first capture here is UV fluorescent, as is the second capture, then UV reflective, the second UV reflective, and then 11 visible bands, and then 2 infrared bands. As you see, it's estimating the capture time remaining then is
2 minutes, 54 seconds.
That's a decent amount of time. Let's use it up. Let's switch over to the presentation. UV captures are still going, still going. So we'll wait for those 4 UV captures before we proceed. Lovely. UV captures are, yeah, that's deep blue, that's deep blue. UV captures are over, so let's take a look at some other examples of paintings and objects we don't have with us here today physically. Here is an example of a painting where the visible, what you would see if you were there in front of the painting, is red flowers, but in deep infrared, there is a clear underpainting underneath it. Can you go back through that sequence one more time, Ben? We're waiting for the. Not bad, right? You can still see the impressions of the flowers, but you are now only really seeing the light reflected by the underpainting. Next. Here's an example of some ink spillage. Invisible, you see very, very dark ink, but in infrared, you can see straight through. Now, I will be the first to tell you, these are cherry-picked examples, right? Not every ink will be transparent infrared or transparent to UV or fluorescent UV, but you don't really know until you image it spectrally because you don't see what is invisible, right? Next. Here's some great examples. Another example here of disappearing ink in case the demo live didn't work for some reason. And here is the UV painting. Again, the visible is, as you saw in person, basically a white canvas with some lines on it. And the UV shows the picture of the tree and the flower and the birds. Done, by the way, by our own Carolyn. Where are you, Carolyn?
Hi.
That was her. She was the artist. She's available for commissions. Next. So now we look at the kit and caboodle result. The kit and caboodle result is going to be using this CH open source target, which you are welcome to come up and see in person. It's the object in the top left corner. Can you zoom in on that target, please?
We're not doing why or ready to go.
Oh, we're still going. Oh, I thought I timed that perfectly. Still 17 seconds. This target is painted physically with paint with different pigments in it. And this is really one of the main use cases. Not the only use case, actually quite a few, but one of the main use cases of spectral imaging is identifying what makes that color. What is that thing that happens to be blue? Because you can make blue by grinding up some beetles, or by grinding up some flowers, or by artificially creating some molecules. And each of those can be blue, in some cases, nearly identical blue, but they will have different spectral reflectivity. And using that spectrum, we can identify, oh, that artist was painting with X, and that artist was painting with Y, or that painting was retouched by a conservator 50 years ago incorrectly or poorly, or that's a forgery, or. So that sort of identification can be very broadly useful. And what we're going to do is we're going to compare the blues in the pigment checker to the blue on our image. So in the bottom right is this hand painted by me. And we're going to ask ourselves, what is that second row? So we're going to jump into that second row and bring up a tool called the readout. Now, in person here, it's going to be a little small on screen. I'm going to show it to you bigger here in just a minute. I want to show it to you working though, because otherwise you may not believe it works. So we grab the little picker, we drop it on ultramarine. On the right side, blue on blue, we'll see a variety of different spectral responses. We'll do the same thing on a different blue called ice blue, made by a different physical process, constituted by different physical things. But that looks also pretty close to the same blue. And we'll then jump over to the painting and we'll drop on the corner there the blue that's there. Again, very small in person, we'll make that bigger in just a second. And what we'll notice is that the two of those are similar and one of them is dissimilar. So let's go ahead and jump over to the presentation and advance some slides. We'll come back to that stuff. Great. So one more slide. Here are those three curves. Now they will not be often absolutely identical, but you can see that the two at the top have a strong infrared reflectivity, meaning they're bright in infrared, but we couldn't see that with our eyes, right? We need a spectral camera to see that. So we can identify this pigment as ultramarine as a result. And can we go back to the image in the software? And can we go to the UV channel, because I've actually hidden a little message in here, guys. Take two down. And when we zoom in there, we'll see. Again. And we're going to zoom out a little bit with two-finger scroll.
Thank you, Des.
Ben's under a tremendous amount of pressure, doing very, very well. Ultramarine, I actually painted in UV ink on the actual object here. You can see it very faintly. Ultramarine. So, we got the right answer. Of course, I knew the right answer going in, so it's not really that impressive, but we would have gotten there then. All right, back to the presentation. So, let's take a look. All the things I just showed you are things that you could do for the last, frankly, 50 years, right? We had various kinds of specialty film to shoot UV or infrared, different cameras over the years. So what makes the Rainbow different? Again, we've been selling solutions that do spectral imaging for a long time, but all the way back to right after the demo. To there. So what differentiates this product from other products that do similar kinds of spectral imaging are, first and foremost, it's a turnkey solution. The bench, the camera, the filters, the modification of not having an IR filter in front of the sensor, everything comes ready to go. It's a solution, not a set of components. It comes with the software necessary both for capture and analysis. It comes with training from us, both on setting it up and taking pictures, but also the basics of spectral imaging. We don't claim to be PhDs in conservation sciences, but we can certainly get you kickstarted like we did today and help your team understand what it is the system does. And finally, support. So if you've been tasked with, hey, get an imaging department capability up for spectral imaging, we can help you from start to finish. The next thing that differentiates it, it's simple. A lot of DIY solutions require a lot of manual steps, a lot of complicated software, a lot of manual tasks, and this just works. It's fully integrated. The camera, the filter, the column, the software, they're all talking to each other so that you can do, in that modern software, one-click capture. You saw each time that Ben went to go do that, he selected a preset, so I guess technically 2 clicks, right? Pick a preset, click capture. And then finally, just because it's simple does not mean we've given up on some kind of power. In fact, I would argue this is the most powerful multispectral system of its kind. It's got 15 bands. It can do both reflective imaging, the imaging of the light itself, or the luminescence or fluorescence of one light into another spectrum. And we can do that, by the way, from UV into each of the visible bands, not just UV into visible broadly, getting us a very, very fine-grained portrait of the spectral characteristics of the object. And it's 150 megapixels at 16-bit raw depth. I'd be the first to tell you, you don't always need 150 megapixels, you don't always need 16-bit tone depth, but in spectral imaging, it's very, very helpful that we can now shoot the entire object. A very common thing in spectral imaging is you kind of limited to say 1 or 10 or 16 megapixels, and you kind of have to pick, oh, we're going to do this section of the painting. Well, what if there wasn't underpainting in the bottom left, but there was in the top right? Are you going to tile every single shot? You can shoot in one capture here, 150 megapixels. And then finally, it has the analysis, at least a good chunk of it, built into the same software you're using to interface the camera and capture. Next. Let's take a look at that one-click capture real quick, just to drive home what we often see, because what DT has done historically is look to see what our clients are doing, and look to see if we can commercialize something that does it faster and easier, right? You all are incredibly intuitive. You have a lot of ingenuity. But to do what I just did manually with the DIY system, buy a camera, send it into Mad Max, they take the filter off, you get it back. You buy some filters, you ask around which filter should I buy, you buy some lights, you ask which lights I should buy. You set it all up, you're gonna go take a picture, you gotta attach the filter to the lens, you gotta focus it, because multispectral imaging, the lens focuses differently each time. You then have to switch the light on that you want to use. You have to change the exposure because each exposure band is going to be different. So one might be half a second, one might be 4 seconds. You have to do an even fielding, otherwise the corner will look reddish or 800 nanometer-ish. Then finally you have to take a picture, and then you have to do it again for 385, and then again, and then again, and then again. I couldn't even fit them all there, right? 17 different captions, repeating those steps manually each time, preferably without touching the camera or being very careful not to misregister the camera so you don't bump anything out of alignment. All of those images then have to be processed, registered, meaning that the slightly different focus has to be accounted for, they have to be slightly increased or decreased in size to fit together, stacked into one holistic stack that could be analyzed. And you might have to create some derivatives like JPEGs or TIFFs or A plus B or B minus A or whatever. All of those steps, every single step I just listed is just the capture in the rainbow. Push the button, it does that stuff. It's even got some of the post-capture analysis built in. We saw just now, showing the spectrum, doing, for example, things like PCA, ICA, and k-means analysis. Now, those are ways of comparing large sets of data to look for things that are moving together versus divergent. So things that are correlated and the same between these bands versus things that are pulling apart in the different bands. And the whole thing here is, I couldn't tell you how PCA works. I am not a PhD in math. And frankly, that's the point. Because the rainbow system, historically, systems like this, you'd have to have a PhD in math. You'd have to have familiarity with MATLAB. Who here, raise your hand if you have familiarity, good working familiarity with MATLAB. Exactly. The people who are doing the imaging don't traditionally have those niche mathematical engineering skills and experience. PCA used to be a huge pain in the butt. Here, click PCA. Sorry, there's two steps. Drag a rectangle over the thing you want to analyze, then push the PCA button. And you get a visual analysis that here you can see shows where we painted in UV, green and blue in the UV paint. Next. Here's another example where we had painted over the blue patch of this one with a UV paint. And because it's behaving differently in UV, you can see it stick out like a sore thumb. The red in the top right there, sort of swirly pattern, is a different pigment, different paint than is the rest of that painting underneath it. That's the kind of thing that is now made accessible and simple in this software and in this solution. So, rainbow, powerful spectral imaging made simple. And you are, of course, very welcome and encouraged to talk to your digital transitions representative for more information, do a demo, do some testing, whatever you'd like. And we do have more information on our website with Heritage. The rainbow, everybody. Into the need for UV goggles. You are welcome to return them if for some reason this is an interesting keepsake for you. You are welcome to keep them. We won't steal them from you, but feel free to return them back there in the corner.
It's a picture.
Yes, sir.
Sorry. Trip over this.
Yeah. locations would be Mid-Atlantic, West Coast, such part of the US, so on and so forth.
We
That'll be forthcoming.
we've got full resolution images. You can actually download the software and use the images without having to have the hardware. So you could go through and do some of the PCA, ICA analysis, the spectral analysis. So it's a pretty easy system to get a good handle on its capabilities on.
Ian, while we're taking questions, are there any questions coming from the virtual?
Yes, we do have one. Can you get an? They're asking about the size, maximum size of the imaging that's available. Or is the atom? They're asking if it's the size of the atom table, or.
It's a great question. So we demonstrated it attached to the DT Atom, which I think is a fantastic way to use it. The entire system can be used on a tripod with an easel or a wall mount or from a ceiling mount. Repositioning it is certainly slightly longer than repositioning a standard IXH. I would allocate 15 minutes instead of 2 or 3 minutes, but it can be used off of the atom. As far as maximum size of the object, one thing you have to understand is that spectral imaging is a very diverse range of techniques. UV fluorescence might require an 8-second exposure for a medium small object, where UV fluorescence for a 10-foot painting might take, 10 minutes. There is no hard technical limitation on our system and how big it can go. But if you are using it for very big things, the exposure times will get longer by quite a bit. And if you're talking about one of the techniques like UV fluorescence that requires a very long exposure, that means you're going from long to very long. So in practice, we would say 30-40 table, maybe the 40-60 table. If you're going to do something larger than that, I would suggest probably tile capturing. But again, that is a practical and workflow limitation, not a technical one. If you wanted to shoot a 10-foot painting, you can do it. It's just the lights will not be very bright. All right.
So any more questions virtually?
Boy, golly, I apologize that you're going straight from me talking, straight to me talking. And if I could have anybody from our team get me a water, please, because I would certainly appreciate that during the presentation. So good afternoon, everyone, again.
You want to take a drink?
Yeah, sure. Let's all take a collective deep breath in. I have a 3-year-old at home. I do a lot of deep breathing with her.
Take 10 seconds, Doug.
All right, we're good to go.
All right.
All right. So I'll now be presenting on a totally different topic, which is artificial intelligence. We're going to do 2 case studies, 2 different projects we've recently completed with clients on artificial intelligence to enhance the metadata of their collection. After me will be Mariana and Hannah. We'll be talking about a 3rd project where we used AI, but I will leave it to them to discuss the use in that context. So I guess I'll awkwardly introduce myself for the 3rd time today. I'm Doug, a Bobcat, go Ohio University. I'm a photographer. That was my degree, was visual communication. I grew up coding. I actually started my first job as a coder in 6th grade. I'm a co-owner at DT. I'm the head of R&D, and I don't want to be sappy, but most importantly, a father for me personally. It's very meaningful, and that is my daughter on the left and right, and my 3-month-old son, who my wife is generously caring for while I'm gone. So I miss them quite a lot. So let's talk about scope for the presentation. AI is a huge, massive, sprawling topic, and it raises, for example, some incredibly important, urgent, and interesting questions around ethics, policies, and politics. And we think those are incredibly important. This presentation is not going to talk about them. But again, as Pete mentioned, we want to talk about those topics together as a community. We want to be a facilitator, instigator, creator of the conversation around those important topics. And if you have anyone, if you're part of a university, you have a professor who's specializing in this, or you're part of a large institution that has a lawyer who's doing this for your organization, we'd love to talk to them about presenting to our group about whatever their thoughts on are these very important topics. Just again, this presentation, not going to be that presentation. It's also not going to be a deep technical presentation. So if you were hoping for like 14 variable equations and long sections of code, that's not this. Today we'll be focused on the theory, the practice, and the workflow of what you can do today in practice, in reality, on the ground with AI in a collection. And we're going to be doing that across 2 case studies. So 2 specific sets of results, the pros, the cons, the goods, the bads, the everything. So first up will be a collaboration we did with the National Geographic. Big thanks goes to Julie McVeigh. I'll just move this. You know what? I'm not going to move that because I'm afraid I'm going to break it, but underneath there is a link and we can certainly put through the chat or something. we presented together, Julie and I did, at imaging.org's, the archiving, the DigiTips online mini conference. And she, because it's a collaboration, she did an enormous amount of the work. I don't want to take credit for that work, but she is not here today, so you'll have to just listen to me. So about this presentation. This was a set of 23 scrapbooks that the National Geographic Society wanted to use AI to help to describe. These documented expeditions undertaken by one Hiram Bingham to Peru between 1911 and 1915. They were funded, the second and further expeditions were funded by National Geographic Society. As a result, they ended up with the physical albums and therefore could have them available for us to work on today. The albums are very frequently requested. They're requested from a variety of stakeholders. So make sure we got that right. Okay, good. Variety of stakeholders, and they're not in great condition, right? They were not intended to be used hundreds and hundreds of times. So as a result, digitization was really prioritized in order to both provide continued access to all these people who wanted to see the stuff and to keep them preserved and in good condition, or at least in their current condition. They digitized them themselves in-house, that is National Geographic did, using a DT Atom and an IXG. They got significant consultation assistance from Spencer Zitterick, who at the time was working at DT. So the collection itself raises, as a collection of expedition images of a very specific kind, raise a host of ethical issues. And Julie did touch on some of those during our joint presentation. I don't feel qualified to speak on their behalf on those topics, but I can tell you the National Geographic Society takes those very, very deeply seriously. So for more on that, I'll direct you to the presentation she did, or to her. I have her email at the end of this presentation. So let's take a look at the technical stuff, the stuff that I am an expert on. They gave us JPEGs that had an image and a caption. That's the JPEGs. Each JPEG was an image and a caption. And when we ran OCR on that, we found that text within the photographic section, the photo, would be added into the OCR description, which was potentially useful in some other context, not at all useful here because we wanted the stuff on the label. So our first task was to segment, which is the computer vision term, segment out the photo and the caption. And we did this using a variety of established computer vision techniques, nothing groundbreaking here if you're in computer vision. And that is to do some stuff like thresholding, and blurring, and eroding, and dilating, so that we can look for specific kinds of shapes. And here you see a shape resulting in the caption and a shape resulting in the photo. Doing that across a large number of images, you then need to have a layer of QC. And you can do that partly through automated QC. For example, we would say we expect there to be one label, one photo. So if we detected two labels, that was flagged for QC. We expected the label to be roughly in the middle to bottom of the image. We expected it to be roughly 3:1, so wide and short. And we expected it to be, the photo to be most of the width of the frame. So that's sort of rules-based semantic QC. If something failed that, it went into a QC folder for visual review. And in some cases, the result was actually totally correct. It was a good decision by the computer, but it bucked the QC rules because I didn't anticipate an exception to that rule, or I anticipated it, but it was an exception to that rule. So for example, empty pages, pages where the label was at the top, which was uncommon, but not impossible. Captions that appeared by themselves without a photo for one reason or another. All of these sorts of exceptions are things that you have to anticipate in advance of any rules-based AI, because there's always an exception to the rule, right? In other cases, the computer vision just completely missed, right? It's got a pretty good accuracy. The better you do it, the better it is, but it's never going to be 100% accurate. And sometimes it's just plain wrong. A good proxy, if you're asking, can computer vision do this, is to squint, because it doesn't see as well as you see. It sees approximately as well as you see when you're squinting at it. So if you can see in this image, when you squint at it, the label in the bottom left, it overlaps and blends in just enough. Computer vision might have a problem. Now, we might well be able to get better results than this by continuing to refine and add new rules and add better AI. But you also don't want to just keep pounding the hammer of AI on a problem that could be just as easily solved by some quick manual labor. we want AI to take pain away from us. That doesn't mean we necessarily want to go to 0% manual labor. So overall, with our second pass of AI, we got to about 90% accuracy. And it was, in my opinion, going to be much faster to simply drag some manual crops over the remaining 10% than to spend more time trying to refine that last 10%, because it just keeps getting diminishing returns, weirder and weirder exceptions as you solve more and more of the problems. So at the end of the day, we cropped about 100 of them by hand. So that left us with some images of labels and some images of photos, and we OCR'd the labels. We have now just a tremendous number of experience. I wish we had like a tally, a billboard that counted the number of pages of historical text that we have digitized and OCR'd. But since our focus is on historic collections and not on office manuals and stuff like that, we have a lot of experience digitizing, dot spread ink on a typewriter on a historical substrate that has been aged or slightly out of good condition. We got pretty good results. This is pretty par for the course for us. Here comes the fun part. Parsing the text for meaning. This is something that AI can be very, very helpful at. For example, each label contained a reference to a number. In some cases, it was a very simple number. In some cases, it was a convoluted, in my opinion, convoluted page item reference. And we needed to parse that out. Now in computer talk, there's something called a regular expression that defines a pattern. If I was talking to my 3-year-old, I could say, find me all the 2-digit numbers, and she could probably be taught to do that. In this case, the regular expression is capital or lowercase p followed by a digit of either 1 or 2 length, followed by one of 3 kinds of dash, an n dash, an m dash, or a hyphen, followed by, in some cases, optionally another 2 digits, followed by, in some cases, an additional 2 letters. So a series or a pattern of characters. Now, I'll be the first to tell you, I'm not very good at regular expressions. I find them very complicated to do. regexer.com is a great way of trying to make them a little bit more accessible. And that's what I used here. We also wanted to find the date. It's going to catch up, right, Ian? That's what it is. It's just delayed. We wanted to find the date. Frustratingly, dates can be written a whole heck of a lot of ways. Fortunately, we're not the first company in the world trying to find dates in text. There's existing libraries. We use 2 of them there, the date util.parser and date finder. It applied some rules like we expect it to be between this year and this year. Finally, we found that a lot of the dates were entered in some atypical ways. For example, 4-letter month abbreviations are not really a thing, but for some reason, the person doing these albums used sept a whole lot. So we manually corrected that. We also looked for slant matches where the OCR was slightly wrong. For example, my very, very strong assumption is anytime we detect the month of November, that they really meant November, and that it is just an indication the typewriter, the E is not quite perfect and the OCR slightly flubbed. So we did some slant matches there and applied some basic QC. Maybe most interestingly, of course, for National Geographic, a place that knows places really well, we wanted to extract and map the locations. Now, this is complicated, right? Because a relevant place name was often identified, meaning a word in there that was a place was correctly identified as a place. And there were some errors as well, for sure, it's not a perfect process. But even when you identified a word that was a place, that doesn't tell you everything. There's additional context here. If a place was identified correctly, it may not be a precise location. It might be a very specific small village, which tells you, within 500 yards where it was. Or it might be a reference to a river or a mountain range, which might go for 500 miles. So a place is not necessarily a place, right? It could be a range of places. It's also important, the context of the text. It could be the place the camera was, or the place the camera was pointing, view of versus view from, right? It could also be a totally spurious place name. For example, if the caption read girl from Ipanema, that's the place the girl's from, not the place the picture's related to, right? She could be in Ipanema in the photo, or she could be on the other side of the world. So we use the basic semantics of if it was in Peru, we included it. If it was not in Peru, we excluded it. And often a village in Russia was detected and filtered out through QC automatically. obviously that being just one example. So we mapped them all out. Fortunately, we had Julie who went, that's useless. Could we please do that by album and not at the project level? And breaking them out by album turned out to be a lot more informative. You start to see some of the patterns emerging. For example, here are two different albums that describe two different paths to Machu Picchu taken by the explorers. Now, it's very important to state that probably a good number of those are wrong or right, but not precise. But taken as a whole, it still shows a narrative at 10,000 feet that is, as validated by National Geographic, correct overall. So even if one or two of the pins or a third of the pins are wrong, that holistic view is still in aggregate useful, informative, right? And in this view, it also makes it easy to go QC those places. The pin at the very top center, the pin at the top left, those would be the first two pins I'd check, right? Because it's possible, certainly, that they diverted for 3 days through the jungle and then stopped and took one photo and then came back. Probably not. Finally, we then went through a keywording algorithm that provided some descriptive keywords. Around 400 keywords were found for a total of 25,000 instances and put out into a keyword visualizer, like you see on the screen here, where we put all of the images that had that keyword, small, low resolution, like 20 kilobyte JPEG, into those folders, and then also labeled each photo with the other keywords that were present on that photo. Because I think the last thing that any institution here should be doing, probably, is just taking these keywords and dumping them in as is, right? Normally what we'd suggest is some sort of affirmative, positive selection of relevant keywords with human review and QC, sometimes with consolidation or renaming, right? So you don't just take the keywords and throw them in. You need to review them, see if any of them are relevant. The ones that are relevant, you need to see if they're accurate. The ones that are both relevant and accurate, you need to decide if that's the term you want to use or if you want to rename that term to something more general, more specialized, more specific, less specific, et cetera. So in summary, we found the labels and we OCR'd them. We found the photos and we keyworded them. We extracted content with specific meaning from the text. We visualized the place names and we visualized the keywords, leveraging quite a few different AI techniques and having a result that was, very frankly, better than National Geographic expected, better than we expected because it was an exploratory sort of collaborative process. Overall, created a lot of value for this collection. Second case study is Estonia. Time check, how much time do I have? Anybody?
You have 10 minutes.
Oh, great, fantastic. So first presented here at VRA, and big thanks to App, who is at the Estonian Archives and did a lot of the work in collaborating with us on this project. First thing I want to show is the impact of resolution on face detection. In general, face detection does not require a lot of resolution. You can actually use pretty low res JPEGs of a face and you'll get pretty good results. One big exception to that are photos where the person appears very small. This was a collection of primarily glass plates and large format negatives. There's a lot of detail in those old photos. They may be 100-year-old technology, but they contained a tremendous amount of detail. And when you have group photos like this, it actually really does matter to have a lot of resolution. So the first step is face detection. Detection just means where is there a face? Nothing more complicated. And the thing about face detection is it's pretty good now. These are real examples from the collection of obscured faces, blurry spaces, faces in the far background of a photo out of focus and turned away from the camera, illustrations, statues, group photos where it found every face in a 40 or 50 person group photo. It's really good. About 40% of the images had a detectable face. Many contained more than one face. After rejecting the faces that were low in quality, so turned away or obscured or very low in detail, we were left with about 72,000 high quality faces, some of which you can see here. So at this point, all we've done is determine face or no face, put them into buckets. And that actually can be of some value, right? Maybe a filter on a web viewer that says, show me images with a face. Just keep in mind, a face is not a person and a person is not a face. So for example, you may have a person in a motorcycle, there's a person in that photo, but there is no face. Or turned away from camera, you don't have a face. So face is not a person, person is not a face. Still pretty useful. All right, so we've detected the faces. Now we want to try to cluster them, to find additional examples of that same face for every face in the collection. We've got 72,000 faces. We certainly don't want to sit there and go, all right, it's Monday morning, 9 o'clock. We're going to go to the first face. Let's find all the instances of this person and then repeat that for 72,000 faces. So we need to first fingerprint, cluster the faces. So let's take a look at this gentleman. Imagine we have here a three-dimensional space. We have three attributes of a face. And we can say that this gentleman has kind of a weak chin. So we'll place him here on the weak side of the chin. He's got an average nose, so right there in the middle of the nose size. And his nose is pretty darn high on his face. So we're going to put it pretty high on that axis. We'll compare that to this gentleman who's got a stronger chin, bigger nose, and his nose is less high up on his face. That puts 2 points on a three-dimensional space. We can already tell by those two dots being pretty far apart, this is not likely to be the same person. Now, imagine instead of using 3 attributes, you use 28 attributes. So now we're not in 3-dimensional space, we're in 28-dimensional space. What does that look like? Don't ask me. We can ask instead the distance in 28-dimensional space for any given face, what other face is closest to it? And looking at the left face, we find this face. Those two are very close on all 28 axes of that 28-dimensional space, implying very strongly they're the same person. Repeat the process, repeat the process, repeat the process, repeat the process. What you end up with is an expansive view of one particular face. Now, we don't want to do this in a linear way. We want to do this in a very advanced mathematical way. The advanced mathematical way we want to do this is called network graph theory. Don't worry, we don't have to do math today. We're going to look at it visually. These are at the individual level. Small little dots, right? That are clustered or grouped together. Let's take a look, zoom in on this to get an idea. Here we see those same 4 photos, and we see how they kind of transit through this clustering such that the last face is actually not that similar to the first face, but because it's similar to the third face, and the third face is similar to the second face, and the second face is similar to the first face, and there's a bunch of other examples of that person that form in that 28-dimensional space, this being compressed on our 2-dimensional space. Again, I don't really understand all that. We can see that they all cluster together. Here's a neat visualization that kind of illustrates that clustering process. All the dots with repulsion and gravity applied based on various characteristics that then naturally parse themselves out into clusters. Pretty, right? Please don't expect me to explain the math of this. I'm a photographer. Okay, so this also helps you visually QC, are my results pretty good before you even start to go look at individual faces. On the left, you see a process of results early in our development process and then later in the development process. And you can see how the clusters are significantly less overlapping and confused. Just don't assume that all overlapping sections mean that you did something wrong. For example, let's take a look zooming in on this particular set of overlapping clusters. Those are a whole bunch of individual frames, individual photos where that face occurred, and there's clear and obvious overlap between those two clusters. So they're both separate and overlapping, right? Everybody saw that? Separate but overlapping. Let's take a look at what those faces were. I don't need the illustration again, I want this. All photos of Stalin. But the northern cluster were statues, while the lower one, the southern cluster, were pictorial examples of the face. So it is true that they are overlapping, but separate. So we've got the clusters, we put them out, we take a look at QC to see how are we doing, because we do not want to use pure math or statistics. We want to start looking at faces. And one of the best kinds of faces to see if you're doing right or wrong are faces that have this very distinct glasses, because glasses are not part of those 28 dimensions. So if a person appears a whole bunch of times with those distinctive glasses on, you can kind of make the assumption it's the same person, in addition to the fact they look like the same person. But you can also validate then that the broader algorithm that's not using the glasses is working correctly. And again, kind of a warning to us as a society, not to get back into the politics and policies and ethics, but you can see here that it's really good, right? Out of focus, blurry, small in the frame, turned away from camera, finds him every time. It finds him at his school, with his family, their close relationships, shows military service, their work. And this is all of us, right? We all wear these different faces. We all have different roles to play in different parts of our life. But we can find this person across all of these parts of their life without any previous guidance or knowing to know to look for him. Let's take a look at a couple other examples here from the collection. Here is a gentleman that appears in 3 of the collections. I forgot to introduce this, but there were 16 institutions. Somebody, Hannah, 16 institutions. And this appeared in 3 of the collections, the Art Museum, the Literary Museum, and the National Museum. Only one time in the National Museum, but that last National Museum one is of a painting of him. And one of them is labeled conveniently with his name. So any of the 3 institutions can now label all of the photos across all of their 3 collections that name. Here's another example. Group photo shows up very well, appears a bunch of times in the National Archives, but only once in the Estonia Literary Museum. Here's an actress, stage makeup, costumes, different outfits, different angles, stage lighting. Finds them every time, and also finds her in one photo in the Estonian History Museum in a collection that's unrelated to and unspecific to her, where we've just picked her up in an incidental part of her life. Maybe the most surprising, the entire collection, was finding this woman flagged in a painting, which I thought meant surely we had made a mistake. Thankfully, for my own sanity, there are a bunch of other photos of her identified, including her standing in front of her painting. And even better, in what I can only assume are her posing for the painting. So yes, I think it's pretty safe, not being expert in the subject, but I think it's pretty safe to assume that's her. Last, and I'm going to go 2 minutes over, last is we can then cluster and find the most common faces. And we have 213 photos across these 16 institutions of this gentleman in the top left, 79 in the bottom right, 80 in the bottom center. Lots of different instances of this. This is the kind of 10,000 foot view holistic aggregate value that we got out of the maps in the National Geographic, right? I can't promise that every single identification is perfect, but I can promise that it provided enormous value in aggregate. And honestly, most of it looked pretty darn good to me. Finally, Pete, can you grab those 2? We have a photo mosaic we made of the 70,000 faces that again prove this sort of, or demonstrate this aggregate value. This is the shield of Estonia. And when you zoom in and zoom in and zoom in and zoom in, there are these 70,000 individual photos arranged such that, and I really like this, the algorithm actually even finds, for example, that we want to make a diagonal dark line here. So it found a photo of a person with darker hair in the top left forming a diagonal on that line, right? So a very nice vivid image. So in summary, here we talked about some parts of this project. There were other parts we were not able to get to in time, but we detected faces, clustered them, found common instances of them, and did a photo mosaic. Fortunately, you have Hannah, who we'll be talking about in the History Makers presentation. The other techniques here of estimating ages, estimating photo dates, and notable person detection, which were also applied to this project. Bunch of links if you want to follow up. And if you would like to follow up with Julie at the National Geographic or app at Estonia, you can email them directly. They welcome your questions and feedback and commentary. Thank you.
We have time for about 4 or 5 minutes of questions.
Oh, we
So
know.
let's
Fantastic.
start in this room first. Any questions?
Yeah. Children. So Doug, can that go back out one slide you had there of that child? Keep going. Oh, it's towards there. Back on there. So 3 on the top, right, almost in the middle. So can we recognize her as an adult?
So when it comes to clustering in ages and anything like, for example, a accident that transformed the physical characteristic of the face, or a surgery that did it on purpose, or other sort of structural changes, aging, accidents, purposeful transformations, what we really need is some connective tissue in the cluster. If we have her only as a child and as a 90-year-old, we got no luck. If we have her throughout the course of her life, we will be able to identify her at 10 or 90, before or after an accident, before or after a surgery, with quite a lot of confidence. And sometimes that will mean you actually get those distinct but overlapping clusters, right? Where you see same person, but distinctly different groupings.
Let's go online. Okay, any more questions in this room? Who's number 1?
That's a great question. They identified him for me and I don't remember. So.
Hold on, we have a question.
Hey, so I saw it earlier in the landscape photo way early, and there was we were trying to recognize the tags of the,
Yeah, keywording.
Yeah, yes. So there is a typo I saw. Machu Picchu. I think it was the either before or after that. There was a typo in there, and I just wondered. Not Picchu.
Yeah, it's on the Amazon man.
Oh, yes, yes, absolutely. Yes, 100%. Yes. Maybe, so I don't remember where, yeah, there we go. Not Machu Picchu,
Yes. So there
which
was
sounds like a
this-
great snack, right?
So like there'll be manual QC. Like so after everything, someone's gonna check out everything.
But it depends on your goals, right? So the very most important thing to understand about AI is it is not magic. It is not 100% accurate. It is also worth noting, for what it's worth, that human beings are also not 100% accurate. So depending on what we're comparing to what, sometimes the AI is actually better, but neither are perfect. And depending on your goals, who's going to be exposed to data, a QC layer is absolutely always required. Maybe several layers of QC. The kinds of mistakes it makes, by the way, fundamentally different from a human, right? So one of the things that we bring to the table is the expertise in knowing how it's going to screw up. So we know what kinds of layers of QC to put in, because mistranscribing that is, for somebody who has any expertise in the collection, very unlikely. But for an AI, M and N, very easy to confuse. Okay, very good.
Any more questions? Okay, Doug, thank you so much.